Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and occasionally when I read my comments, I see something that makes me stop and think, because thinking is something I try to do on occasion. And someone kind of got into a discussion of saying, well, the close grip bench press, that's great for triceps, but it doesn't really work the chest. And you have to wonder sometimes that a lot of these bodybuilding ideas, that the human body is like this stack of Legos that you just put together, and that you can actually isolate muscles, or that muscles that are primary movers on a big exercise somehow don't get stimulated or can't even be stimulated maximally. You really have to wonder how this sort of nonsense has ever been pushed onto people. Like, how much work has it taken in the fitness community and bodybuilding world to actually convince people of things that are so absurd that a basic anatomy chart should be able to prove them wrong? Like, it should actually be possible to convince people of these things. Like, it actually displays an enormous lack of understanding of the muscle structures of the body. Like, it's almost impossible that people can be convinced of this stuff, yet they are. I mean, that's a perfect example. Take the closed grip bench press. Look at the mechanics of the exercise, particularly when you go all the way down, or like I'm even doing pausing at the bottom. The pectorals on a closed grip bench press are still the primary movers. In other words, they do more of the work than any other muscle in the body. Now, the anterior deltoids do get worked pretty hard. The triceps get worked pretty hard. But to say that it isn't a chest exercise, it's impossible. Look at the human body and look at what the function is of the muscles in the body. The pectorals actually do more work than the triceps on the closed grip bench press. Now, just because it's a harder exercise to do, and because you have to move the weight a further distance, and that there's a slightly different rotation of the shoulder joint, doesn't make the chest work any less. It's the primary mover. It is the primary mover, with triceps being a close second, and then anterior deltoids. So where do people get these ideas? And it's always weird stuff like, oh, grip width affects this stuff more or less, and it really doesn't. Grip width on a lot of these torso movements just change the range of motion. Now, it isn't to say that it doesn't change the ratios of, say, how much bicep versus lat is used, or how much tricep versus chest is used, but it's not an enormous change. It's not like you suddenly cut the amount of activation in that muscle in half or something by changing the grip width. You don't. And if anything, the exercises just become more difficult with certain changes in grip width. But that doesn't start removing muscles from it. But yeah, the closed grip bench press absolutely works the pectorals, and even more so if you come all the way down and you pause at the bottom. It obviously does. Now, there are people who perform the closed grip bench press with such an awkwardly narrow grip that they feel it more in their forearms and wrists, because they grip the bar so narrow that it puts the wrist in a compromised angle where they can't even physically touch their chest with the bar. But that's not a closed grip bench press. That's a ridiculous counterindicated exercise that will actually hurt you and cause all sorts of inflammation and everything in your wrists over time. That exercise really has no place in a balanced training routine. But yeah, closed grip bench press is a fantastic exercise. And it's the same thing. I mean, we look at exercises like different rows and lat pull downs and other exercises for the back, and people actually get this idea that they don't work the biceps. Yet, when you go look at human studies done, and when I say human studies, I mean to where we actually took MRIs and measured the muscle growth. We didn't just take a tape measure and wrap it around the arms, where actual researchers did before and after MRI measurements to actually look inside the body and see how much the muscles grew, and track it with a computer that could actually measure it. You know what they find? In novice lifters, lat pull downs cause just as much muscle growth as bicep curls do, right? They cause just as much bicep growth as doing curls do. And if you add curls to the lat pull downs, you don't gain any more muscle than if you had just done the lat pull downs in your biceps. Now, I'm not saying that more advanced lifters, that might always be the case. It does seem to be based on the data, but one could make the argument it's not an efficient line of pull. It's not the ideal angles to maximally recruit the biceps. So maybe it's just because they're noobs. So a really advanced lifter might need an exercise that gives you a little more efficient angle for more muscle fiber recruitment to really grow the biceps maximally. There's an argument for that. There is a strong argument for that. However, that is a hypothetical argument. It's not actually supported by evidence either. Evidence kind of went the other way. The evidence still shows that things like rows and lat pull downs grow the biceps just as much as curls do, even in people who've been training a couple years. Same thing. We know that triceps grow from the regular bench press just as much as they do from a tricep extension. There's been data looking at it, and again, where they actually took legitimate measurements and tracked it in multiple people to see what happened, with a couple different groups to study the variables, and it's been found to be the case. And, here's the thing. When it comes down to exercises that do use muscles to a greater or lesser extent, what you need to remember is that these things of saying, well, this compound works this big muscle or this smaller muscle less than this variation, so therefore it's going to cause less growth. Well, that's only true with low volume training. And if you are training really low volume, that actually does matter. There's some truth to that. In other words, if you only do 1 or 2 sets and that's it, you don't do 3 sets, 4 sets, 5 sets or more of an exercise, there's some truth to that. If you come in and do just 1 set to muscle failure, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. An exercise that doesn't use that primary mover as efficiently, meaning in terms of the angle of pull and stuff, it may not grow maximally. It might grow a lot less than the other primary movers. But here's the thing. With volume comes more muscle stimulation and more growth. That's why we know one of the biggest driving factors of hypertrophy is training volume. And here's the thing. With that training volume, we see diminished returns. In other words, if you came in and did 5 or 6 sets of lat pull downs, for example, your back would probably start seeing very diminished returns by that 3rd set, meaning you'll gain a little more muscle in it from the 4th and 5th set. You will gain a little more, but it's only going to be a hair more. But the biceps, because of the additional work, because maybe they're only being stimulated about 50 or 60% as effectively as they could be because you've got the hands pronated and everything, what happens is that over those multiple sets, the fatigue does start to build up in those muscles. And why that additional fatigue is adding very, very little to, say, the latissimus dorsi, it's adding very large amounts of additional stimulation when you're doing multiple sets to those muscles that aren't being recruited as effectively. And that's kind of the thing that where people look at the research and they say that doesn't make sense until you realize that they're actually using relatively high amounts of volume. Like some of these studies that looked at that were doing like 5 sets of 10. All right, 5 sets of 10 on any compound movement is a lot of volume, particularly if you're taking those sets close to failure. That's an enormous amount of volume. That's an enormous amount of training volume from a muscle fiber stimulation perspective. So what you're going to find is that even muscles that are recruited a little bit less effectively are going to get sufficient stimulation to see good muscle growth just due to the sheer amount of volume then being thrown at them versus a more efficient exercise that a couple of sets might actually start reaching all those upper threshold fibers and fatigue them. So again, when volume comes into play, I think people have to understand that a lot of these ideas about hypertrophy and big compound movements start to go away because the muscles that maybe wouldn't be stimulated as maximally as you might like that are still primary movers, if you only did 1 set, maybe 2 sets, they do get worked to a much, much larger degree as the volume starts to go up. So ultimately, what people need to understand, exercise selection itself, in the grand scheme of things, for hypertrophy only, we're not talking about performance, we're not talking about joint angle specificity, strength, power, any of that. When we are talking about purely hypertrophy, your gains, training volume is probably more important than exercise selection. All right, it is probably more important than exercise selection. I'm not saying exercise selection doesn't matter, because exercise selection can bring more muscles into something. It has performance differences. It has joint angle specificity, strength differences. But in terms of actual muscle growth, no, total volume, total work done is probably more important than exercise selection. In other words, if if you came in and did 5 sets of back pulls that maybe weren't the best exercise for your biceps, but you did 5 sets of 10 with nearly maximal 10 rep weight, versus if you only did 1 set of curls, 2 sets of curls, even with a perfect exercise that shows the greatest EMG activity, the lat pull downs are probably still going to put more size on your biceps. Again, this is what we've noted over the years of looking at the research people in labs. Volume and work done seems to be the most important driving factor in hypertrophy. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.